My father came from Greece. He was born in Sparta, Greece. By the way, cheer the Spartans on tonight. He was born in 1892, came to America in 1907, and once he got here, he ended up in Omaha, Nebraska, as a water boy on a railway, and then as a shoe shine boy, and he didn't like that. The race riots were going on at that time, and he felt intimidated, so he ended up in Chicago as a waiter. And there's some photographs there that show him as a waiter in 1912. You're welcome to look at the photographs and the memorabilia later. And in 1912, he and two other fellow Greeks from the same village, Asopo, Sparta, Greece, bought a sign from the defunct Boston Cafe in Chicago and had it transported to Lansing and located it where the Boston Cafe was in the 100 block west on Michigan Avenue. And it was one of the oldest restaurants in Lansing at that time. And from then, knowing how Greeks are, not getting along with each other and so on and so forth, they split off, and eventually my father and two partners opened up the Lansing Cafe in 1914. So that's how it all started.
We came to Lansing was the question, yes? Okay. Our family is Greek as well. My great-grandfather was the immigrant from Greece, and he came in through New York, Ellis Island, and made his way to Grand Rapids in the early 1900s. And there he staked his claim and was a restaurateur in Grand Rapids. And raised a family there. And when my father was ready to go to graduate school, college and graduate school, he came to East Lansing for Michigan State. Again, go Spartans. So I was born in East Lansing, and I've lived in East Lansing until I was about 18. Then I moved to the east side, just a few blocks away from here, and been here ever since. So that's there was no other place that it was possible that I could start a restaurant but in this wonderful neighborhood here, so it had to be. So that's how we got here.
My family came from a region known as Calabria, the city of Calabrese. Calabria is a region in the lower part of Italy where the boot, I should say the leg, goes into the foot. It's right on that curve right there, right on the coastal part of Italy. My grandfather, I believe it was 1916, came over by himself, left a pregnant wife to make a new start in the United States. He also voyaged and landed in Ellis Island. I didn't know this, but I guess you just don't check in and they move you along and you're on your own. We stayed there for a couple of days to get blood tests and to see if you had diseases or anything else like that. And while he was there, he heard there was work on the railroad in Elkhart, Indiana. Well, after he was processed, it became, I should say, when he was ready to go, that's where he went. He went right from New York to Indiana. Worked on the railroad there. I don't know if you've ever been to Elkhart, Indiana, but there are so many railroads in that city. It's unbelievable. I probably would be in the shock and tire business if I was down there. Anyway, while he was there, he also heard that there was a place called Motor Wheel that was opening up in Lansing, Michigan. He immediately left the job there, went up, applied, and got hired and made wooden wheels for not cars, but for like fire apparatuses. I think at that time they were still drawn by horses. There's a perfect example of the wooden wheel. I don't think he really worked on that particular one, but if there's an insurance company on Grand River and it's housed in glass, and that apparatus was used to put out fires, and those have wooden wheels, and that's exactly what he did. So working at Motor Wheel on those, he saved up enough money and sent away for my grandmother, who at that time had my Aunt Mary, who was 7 years old. They came not through Ellis Island, but from a port in North Carolina. He went and picked them up, and they came back to Lansing, and he wanted so bad to be his own boss. And he opened up a fruit stand right where we are today. And this was before Prohibition. And he would sell fruit and produce and vegetables, and they lived upstairs, and you probably have seen the apartments upstairs above the buildings. And of course, my grandmother would bring him lunch and bean soup and pasta and things like that, and would fill the place up with that aroma. And people were coming in going, well, I'll have a cup of bean soup. No, me, that's for that, no. So he obviously got the idea, well, we're gonna start some bean, and one thing led to another, and then Prohibition ended. And it wasn't like everybody got a license, and it wasn't just flooded with mass licenses for beer and wine and liquor. In fact, liquor came afterwards. I don't know if anybody knew. They just incrementally gave several to Detroit licenses, one in Traverse City, one here in Lansing, and one in Grand Rapids. And we, Emil, got the very first beer and wine license. Now, liquor came a couple of years afterwards. And then, of course, everybody started incrementally getting it in. They just did flood the whole United States, and they didn't know what to expect. So we still, to this day, have the original beer and wine license for Lansing, Michigan. And we are, because Jim's Tiffany no longer is there, we are the oldest restaurant in the city. So that's how this whole thing came apart. It's a much longer story, but in a nutshell, that's how it all. It was just something that we did. All of us in the family worked at the restaurant. We grew up at the restaurant. Back then, we were actually closed today on Sundays, and basically that's all we talked about, how we could make it better, what went on. And my dad would come home, he would say, you can't believe what just happened there. And then it was just something that was just in my blood, and today I can't imagine doing anything else.
For me, I think it's always just been in my blood. I never knew my great-grandfather. He was the restaurateur from Greece that opened a restaurant in Grand Rapids. I never knew him. He passed away before I was around. And my father, he had nothing to do with restaurateuring. But it was still in the blood. And my parents have always been great hosts. We've always had, ever since I was a kid, they've always had these wonderful, lavish parties and events and holidays where I just learned hosting as being part of, just part of our family. Just inviting people into our house and giving them food and drink and making sure that they have a good time. I mean, it's just always been our culture around my family. So when I was in my troubled teenage years, I was banging around trying to make some money and ended up washing dishes in a local restaurant. And I noticed, what are those guys and girls over there doing? They're cooking. Wow, they're so cool. They had the checkered pants on, and they were cussing and burning themselves. And they were just, to me, the coolest people I ever saw. So I knew by working around them that I wanted to give it a try. And eventually, another local restaurateur is no longer in business, but Joan Nelson from Signatures in East Lansing in my early 20s gave me a shot in his kitchen. And I worked on the line as a sauté cook, put me right on the line, and really liked my work, and eventually offered me a job with more responsibility, and eventually offered me the executive chef position of his kitchen, which really got me started and helped me to really learn the business as far as managing costs and things like that. But really, once I started working in the kitchen cooking, I knew it was really the only thing that I was supposed to be doing. And as time marched on, I worked as a chef for about 8 years, and similar to your story, I knew in my heart that I had to work for myself. My great-grandfather worked for himself. My grandfather owned a liquor store in Grand Rapids, a party store. He worked for himself. My father was a scholar, worked for himself, and I just knew I needed to do the same thing. So we searched for opportunity and came upon the empty space over there on Michigan Avenue where we are now, and my wife and I decided to give it a go and started out as a weekday lunch-only restaurant and served up some good food, just me cooking and one guy serving, and then it's grown into what it has today. So I think to answer the question again, to come around full circle, it's always been just kind of a genetic blood thing, just hosting, inviting people, feeding them, serving them, making sure they have a good time.
I want to mention to Paul that I still have fond memories of Emil. Stan Brower, I don't know if you ever remember him, Brower's 1861 house. We would get together.
Oh, down the German guy downtown? Yes,
okay.
yes, absolutely.
And go down and listen to The Godfather. I mean, that was the image that he gave. We loved him. And he had stories to tell that should have been written down. I don't know if they were. Anyway, back to my career. I saw my father through the 1930s and the Depression times working 7 days a week, 15, 16, 17, 18 hours a day. And by the time I was in junior high school, I had decided I don't want any part of the restaurant business. I said, this is no way to go. But I really didn't have any choice. My father says, well, if you want to go to college, you're going to have to work at the restaurant. I need you. So going way back to 1940, I started working for him. And finally, by 1980, I was out. But my long-term aspirations was to have been an attorney. And even while I was in the restaurant business, I went to DCL, Detroit College of Law, for one semester, just to get the feel of what it would be like to be an attorney. But working 6 days a week at the restaurant, 10, 12, 13 hours a day, and going to law school didn't work out. So I stayed in the restaurant business. My father became seriously ill several times, and I had to basically take over. I had no choice. And I said, well, we're at this level here at Michigan State University. I, at that time, was in the School of Hospitality Business, and I was learning what the latest techniques were, and so I tried to adopt them at the restaurant. And this is true confessions occasionally, to say the least. My father and I went head to head because he was from the old school and disagreed with me, but I said, if we're going to survive, we're going to have to keep going upscale, and we did. And eventually, who was the proudest person of all was my father, Papa Jim. And I'll never forget one little incident with him. This is after he had supposedly retired. He walks into the restaurant on a Saturday evening, and there's this whole crowd of people waiting to be seated. Well, he didn't realize that that was the problem. So he goes barging into the restaurant, looking for me. He says, why are all these people waiting at the door? Why aren't they seated? And I tried to explain to him. I said, Papa Jim, I said, we're full. We don't have any space for these individuals. And then he started, I'll never forget this, going from table to table and picking up empty dishes, sort of giving the hint to people that it's time to leave. And anyway, we finally convinced him that he should take one of his many trips to Greece, and he enjoyed himself there, and we enjoyed ourselves back at the restaurant. So that's a brief description of my career. Lots of competitors came in. Archie Tarpoff's place, Brower's 1861 house came in, Dine's restaurant came in, and all of those started giving us a tough time competition-wise. And we decided that if we're going to survive, we're going to have to come up with something special. And one of the things that helped make us extremely successful was the introduction of Greek food to the Lansing community. There must have been, I don't know how many dozen restaurants that were all Greek-owned in the greater Lansing area, but none of them featured Greek food. And I'll never forget, the person that got us started on the Greek food was acting president of Michigan State University, Walter Adams. He said, I have a group of friends, about 30 of us, that have been to Greece, and we'd like to know if you could put on a Greek dinner for us. And I said, sure, why not? So he reserved our, at that time called the Century Room, and we put on an entirely Greek menu. It was so successful that we started to have Greek nights every couple of months with Greek musicians. The waitresses dressed up with Greek outfits that my wife had gotten from Greece, and it was all Greek menu, and those were absolute sellouts. So we adopted those Greek specialties to our regular menu, and then we kept upgrading from that point. At that same time, my wife and I fell in love with Tiffany era lamps and stained glass, and decided that the motif would be that of Tiffany lamps. Unfortunately, the real Tiffany lamps were too expensive, so we were buying authentic Tiffany era lamps. Lamps that had been built, made anywhere from the early 1900s through the 1920s. So by the time we sold the restaurant, we had over 100 lamps, and plus stained glass windows. A little side, I don't know if any of the Kozaczeks are here today, but some of the stained glass and leaded glass windows that we had at the restaurant came from the Kozaczek mansion. When it was being torn down, David Kozaczek, I believe, Dick Kozaczek said, this is going to be destroyed, would you like to use them at the restaurant? And so we incorporated it into the motif at the restaurant. The back bar that maybe some of you still remember in the cocktail lounge came from the Epicure restaurant. And again, an interesting story there. The urban renewal was going to demolish the building the following week, the week following the time we were there to pick up some of the artifacts. And I'll never forget it, that we must have left a small fortune in memorabilia that was in the basement of the Epicure restaurant. Just beautiful things that they used for their candy store. But the owners at that time that had inherited the restaurant, they were from Greece, had no understanding of the value, of the potential value of these items. And on the following Monday, the demolishers came in and everything was gone except the back bar that we saved.
I don't know that our restaurant is necessarily different or unique per se. I think when I think of the Soup Spoon, I think of eclectic. If you've been there, it comes to mind. We try to pull from decor to menus to cocktail offerings, a hodgepodge of the very best from everywhere we can. So unique as far as we go after the best things, but push them all together without a common theme. So I don't know if that makes any sense. I'm not sure it makes sense to me, but our role in the community has always been the idea of, and I say it quite a bit, of upscale food, upscale service in a casual, all-inclusive setting. So, and that's the kind of thing that we've always tried to roll out. We want to have the very best food, the finest scratch-made products, the best, freshest, locally sourced things. We're really, really keen on finding the best ingredients, especially from local sourcing, just because, you know, just the fact that the shorter the distance has to travel, the fresher the product's going to be. And we want to support the local economy too. I'd rather, you know, keep those dollars in here in this great state. So that's kind of what our role has been. And it's also a meeting place. I mean, I see we have so many regulars and so many people. We have the coffee group on Tuesdays and Friday mornings. I mean, you come in there at 10:30 on a Tuesday morning and it's like you're walking into at midnight at a bar. I mean, they're hooting and hollering and having such a good time, and everybody, all these faces become very familiar. And the Soup Spoon seems to have kind of grown into this little spot where people meet and share experiences and bring their wives out for anniversaries and celebrate birthdays, and that's really important to me. That's the best part of the whole thing, is that that we've got an atmosphere. We've done our job of creating an atmosphere where people feel comfortable and welcome no matter what. You can walk in with blue jeans and mud on your shoes and feel good. You can walk in a suit and tie after a nice show or before a nice show and feel good too. I mean, we have that table sitting right next to the other table on the same evening, and everybody's getting along. So I think all-inclusiveness for the community has been our main focus and main goal, and I think that we're on the path to succeeding in that avenue.
Well, I think, I take that back. I know people love nostalgia. I don't think there's anybody in this room that has never said to themselves, gosh, I wish we had the good old days, or I used to have, I haven't seen that since I was a kid. We have the restaurant that is right down from the hospital. So mothers and their families, before they would even go home, and still do, come in, get the soup, get the pasta, get whatever, because they're starving, they just had a baby, and they're bringing these kids in before they even go home. And they bring them up, and I see them go through grade school, I see them go through high school, I watch them as they bring their boyfriends in for their proms, their girlfriends in for their very first date, and now they're having their own families and doing the exact same thing. I can look around right now and see kids that now have their own families, and I really believe that's the niche that Emil's has, is everybody likes nostalgia. Not to mention that we will never change the recipes at all, ever, from the sauces to the soups. Those are my grandmother's recipes, and I know people come for that as well. But I think it's just being around for so long, for being so nostalgic, that people really, really like that. And you know, you've got to have good service, and you've got to have the atmosphere and everything else a restaurant needs to survive. Yeah, we've got that. But I think being around so long and giving back to the community has been our niche.
Speaking of recipes, do you have a favorite?
You know, I could eat pizza probably every day. I guess that's not a recipe, but we're not really known for the greatest pizza in the city, but I would put my pizza up against anybody's. And we do have the lasagnas and the sauces and stuff, but I could eat our pizza every single day.
What about you, Nick?
I want some Emil's pizza. I just want to say that
Thank you.
we pretty much, my wife and I, lived on your pizza for many, many, many years. We lived in right over here, so yeah, I can attest to that. Favorite recipe? I couldn't say that I have a favorite recipe because, you know, I go through different stages of what I like. But I can tell you this, that our seafood chowder is the soup that built the soup spoon. So, I mean, that was the first, one of the original things that we rolled out when we were just doing sandwiches, some pastas, a little seafood, and our soups. You know, we're on the Soup Spoon Cafe, and our seafood chowder was the hook, and it always has been the hook. People to this day come in and they just want to get a quart of soup. I just need a quart of chowder to go. So I think for us and for me, that's the, you know, soup to me is the ultimate comfort food. When I don't feel well, I go straight for soup. When it's cold outside and I want to snuggle in, I go straight for soup. It's just, so our soup recipes, and what I'll say about our soup recipes too is that there's only a couple that we actually have written down. We have our seafood chowder written down, our French onion written down, and our tomato basil. Those are the 3 soups that we actually have recipes for. Everything else is just on the fly, off the cuff. Whatever's in the cooler, we throw it together and make soups. But specifically, the seafood chowder is the winner on that one. So.
Now we know you have to talk about the rice pudding, right, Angie?
This is all past tense, but first of all, I have to do a little bit of bragging that Gourmet Magazine awarded us a fine dining certificate back in the 70s, which was an exceptional honor for excellent food, excellent service. True confessions, though, on my part, I am not, I never have been a chef. I had the good luck of a wife who took my mother's and my aunt's recipes, wrote them all down, and we standardized the Greek food items. And of those, the Greek foods, I love Betty's algolemino soup, the egg lemon soup, and the rice pudding. And if you want to know how good our rice pudding was, you could go to Giorgio's Pizza and ask for their rice pudding, and you'll get an idea of how good our rice pudding was, because it's the same recipe. As far as, speaking in the past tense, it's very difficult to say what was your favorite, because in operations, from my perspective, we were so busy making sure that the customer was served correctly and that the food was hot and that it was tasty. I didn't really have that much time to have favorites on my part.